Good afternoon, everybody. We're just waiting for people to make their way in from the waiting room. So welcome everybody to the Festival of Trusteeship. This session is about the differences between being a trustee of a small organisation and a large organisation, and I think it's going to be extremely interesting. So first of all, before I pass over to Vic, who's chairing this session, a few bits of housekeeping. You will have seen that the session is being recorded. You will all get sent the recording. Weekly pass holders, you'll get all the recordings from the week at the end of the week. Please stay muted as you are on the call. You've been muted on the way in automatically. Please stay muted unless Vic comes to you for a question. Closed captions have been enabled at our end. So if you want subtitles, you need to press the CC or closed captions button on your device. Please feel free to use the chat to ask questions, to share reflections. Please keep your comments respectful. Equally, if you find the chat really distracting, as some people do, feel free to completely ignore it. It is on the recording if you want to catch up afterwards, and Vic will always repeat the question that she is putting to the panel. We're holding networking sessions at the end of today and tomorrow. If you'd like a chance to come along and meet with other fellow aspiring and serving trustees to chat through some of the issues that you've heard here and elsewhere in the festival, we'll post a link to the networking session in the chat. We'd love to see you there. It's also in your follow-up email, and weekly pass holders, it's in your morning link email. Thank you to our media partner, Third Sector, who have helped us to shout about the festival. And today we hit 401 weekly pass holders and 900 and something individual bookings. So they really helped us. And then a giant thank you to Ecclesiastical, they're our festival sponsor. And it's thanks to them that the maximum you'll pay to attend the festival is £5 a session. And many of the sessions are free of charge. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Faith from Ecclesiastical, who's going to say a few words.
Oh, thanks ever so much, Penny, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Faith Kitchen. I'm representing Ecclesiastical Insurance today, and we are honoured to be sponsoring the Festival of Trusteeship again this year. As a specialist insurer and risk management partner for charities, we're committed to the sector and have been for over 135 years now. We support the sector not only with our specialist expertise, but also our expert knowledge of the sector through research, and some of our research on trustees has been used for sessions along this week as well. We've also just launched our Charity Risk Barometer report. That includes all of our latest research on the charity sector. If you haven't seen that yet, it was promoted by Third Sector last week. Then you can find it on our website as well. You may also be aware that Ecclesiastical Insurance is part of the Benefact Group. And if you're not, they're a group of financial services companies that give all available profits to good causes. And we are currently the third largest corporate donor in the UK, with aspirations to reach number one. Also, if you're not aware, the Benefact Group run a programme of giving each year, which is open to any charities perhaps that you may be representing today or a trustee for, called the Movement for Good Awards, and anyone can nominate a registered charity in the UK, Ireland, etc., or a KIC or non-profit for a grant of £1,000 at any time in the year, and larger grants windows open as well once a year. But also we're having a special draw this week for anybody involved in young people or children's charities for £5,000 grants. So if you are one of those, please do pop your form in. It takes about 30 seconds. So thank you ever so much. We hope you enjoyed the festival and today's session, of course. Thank you very much, Penny.
Thank you, Faith. And straight over to Vic, who's chairing this event.
Thanks, Penny, and thanks so much for inviting me to chair this session. I'm really interested to hear about this. I've spent the last 15 years or so working in the small charity sector pretty specifically, so I'm really interested to hear the answers from our panel today. On our panel, we've got Michael and Ange, Pen and Menai, and I'm going to pass to them to do a quick introduction and tell us a bit about themselves and about the organisations where they've been trustees, and then we're going to move straight on to questions. So, Menai, shall we start with you?
Thank you, Vic. Good afternoon, Prananda, everybody. So I'm Menai Owen-Jones, and I've been a trustee for the past 6 years, actually. So I started in 2017 as an elected trustee for Akivo, which is the Association of Chief Executives of Voluntary Organisations. And over the past 6 years, I've been really pleased to be a trustee of a startup charity, medium-sized charities, and large organisations as well. Currently, I'm a trustee of Wales Council for Voluntary Action, which is the membership body for voluntary organisations in Wales, and also a governor of Cardiff Metropolitan University, and where our income is around 140 million plus. So a very large organisation. Thank you.
Thanks, Menai. Michael, can we come to you next, please?
Yes, I was a chartered accountant in practice, became a partner in Grant Thornton in the 70s, and set up the charity not-for-profit unit in the 90s, and it was one of the third largest. But if you look at the charity trustees that I've been involved in, I was looking down the list, and there's no theme to it. But as my daughter put it, I think very nicely, she said, "Dad, whatever charity you're in, you become passionately boring about it," which I thought was quite a good acumen. I've been involved in 2 lots of prison charities for 20 years, marriage counselling for 25 years. I was a counsellor, a big international NGO, a children's charity that took children with disabilities on holiday, the RSPCA, Durham University, and Care International, which was one of the top 6 NGOs in the world, with a massive turnover. And lastly, for the fun of it, I was a trustee for 6 years of London City Ballet, and I actually danced Swan Lake at Sadler's Wells by accident.
I'm going to save a follow-up question on that, Michael, for the end of the session. I'm curious to know how that went down. Thank you. Ange, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you, Vic. Hi, everyone. I'm Ange Handler. I'm an associate of Getting on Board. I'm an experienced charity trustee. I've been on boards and committees for about 20 years now, and most recently, I was an independent governor of Leeds Arts University, which is a small and specialist arts university in the north of England. I was chair of its search and nominations committee and a member of its remuneration committee. And for 5 years consecutively, alongside that, I was chair of an Arts Council England national portfolio organisation, Freedom Studios, which is based in Bradford, just up the road from me. I'm based in Leeds.
Brilliant, thank you, Ange. And finally, Pen.
Thanks, Vic. So I've been in trustees and committee roles about the last 10 years now, and they're all roughly in the heritage sector, which is sort of where I inhabit. I started off really small, so I was originally a committee member, but then a trustee when we became a charity of a small museum in Wales, which is the Newtown Textile Museum. And then went on to be a trustee and then eventually chair of the Office Dyke Association. So we looked after the National Trail and the landscapes around it and a small heritage centre. And I now sit on a few boards. So I'm the chair of the board of the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists. I'm also trustee of the National Coal Mining Museum, which is very dear to my heart because I grew up in West Yorkshire. So I'm just on the road from you, Ange. I'm in Bradford, actually, but grew up in Wakefield, where the museum is based. And I'm also on the council for the Association of Industrial Archaeology. So we're called council members, but in legal terms, we're trustees. So quite a variety of organisations that I currently sit on. The Mining Museum is probably the biggest, with a turnover of several million, including government grants. And then the Association of Industrial Archaeology is more like a couple of thousand. So some big scales going on.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a really amazing cross-section of experience represented here. I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion. So for those of you listening, I've got a couple of conversation points that I'm going to start us with. And then if you do have questions, please pop them in the chat. I'll be trying to monitor the chat throughout our conversation, but I'm planning to leave some dedicated time towards the end of the conversation. I will try to keep an eye on things as they come in, but if I miss your question and you're really desperate for it to be answered, please just pop it again in the chat so that it comes to the top of the pile. Okay, let's start then. The first discussion point that I'm interested to cover is, for you, what the most noticeable differences are of being a trustee of a smaller organisation versus a larger one. And Ange, I think we'll come to you first.
Thanks, Vic. Structure, I think, would be the key thing. Noelle Rumble was a fellow governor at Leeds Arts Uni, and she's a real supporter of these sessions, but I can't see her today on this one. But she says, if you like to give good meeting, maybe consider a larger charity. And I think that's a really fair point. So obviously, within a university setting, we had various committees. There were staff committees that reported in as well, highly professionalised executive team. So the mucking in and rolling your sleeves up, it wasn't really something you have to do within a larger charity. Obviously, COVID was a notable exception to that. All of us stepped up, no matter what size of charity. And I think with the smaller ones, just being willing to sometimes step in to a more operational role in times of emergency. I think when assets and resources are scarce, that's when that happens. Shouldn't be all of the time, in my view, you know, and that I see that, and especially where there are few or no staff in small charities, that to me is the key difference. It's really about resources, assets, etc., and that creates the difference in terms of what you will be doing and what you will be governing.
Thanks, Ange. And Menai, what about you? What are some of the most noticeable differences that you've seen in your experience?
Thanks, Vic. Yeah, I'd echo what Ange has just said, really. I think obviously as trustees, our legal responsibilities and duties as trustees are the same, regardless of the size of the organisation. However, I think what you therefore then spend your time doing and can depend on the organisation. So as Ange said, a large organisation like, for example, Cardiff Met has a number of subcommittees. So you can spend time on the main board, on subcommittees, but also activities outside of those main kind of boards, subcommittees as well, getting to know the organisation and so forth. Whereas in smaller organisations, maybe there are fewer subcommittees, you're spending less time, but actually there may be that you can help out a bit more. There may be more of an expectation to help out on operational aspects, which are outside of your trustee duties. And obviously sometimes I'm sure we'll come to talk about challenges of blurred lines, but I think sometimes what you spend your time doing, you know, can be different depending on the size of the charity.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I've heard echoed from colleagues as well, not just kind of in those trustee roles, but with sort of various roles that people might have with smaller or larger organisations. Definitely a lot more operational involvement with smaller organisations. Pen, we'll come to you next.
I think I'd probably just like to echo that last point, and it's that blurring of the lines between governance and operational that happens in smaller organisations. You find yourself pulled into a lot more hands-on, like if you're around your building, you're in that building, you're doing things, you're looking after the staff, whereas the larger operation gets the easier and probably more proper systems are in place so that you have got committees who are dealing with things, you have got systems that you're following, you've got structures in place, you've usually got a lot more staff that things are delegated out to and that you delegate your authority to. So I think there's difference in types of delegation or authority on those different scales of charities and groups.
Thank you. And Michael, what are the main differences that you've observed?
Well, I've been a trustee of a three-staff charity. And I could say from that you become very hands-on, whether you like it or not. And you have to occasionally stand back and say, what is my role as a trustee? Not as what's my role of doing this charity and helping this charity. What's my role as a trustee? And that's quite hard to do. And when you get into larger charities, you were saying earlier, the structure and the committees and everything are there for you, and you drop into them and help in the proper trustee role, so you're not getting involved in the doing. And I think the other big difference between the two is that when you're on a large charity, you can say, oh yes, I'd like a complete analysis of that, and I'd like before the next board meeting in triplicate, 3 pages long, and I'd like the analysis of the last 30 years. When you're in a small charity, you realize there is nobody to get that for you, and you can get it yourself, but asking for it to be produced doesn't work. And so there's a difference of working out who's in the charity, who's going to do what you ask, and therefore is your request in a board meeting a valid request. And the final one of that is, and I think it is true for all charities, that my experience of small charities is the minute taking and minute recording is poor, and it results in people trying to look back at what the decision was, and they haven't actually got it documented. So I don't really try and suggest that trustees of small charities get proper minutes done. And actually, if you find somebody who is interested, they might just come and take the minutes for you. And if they're good minute takers, they'll be delighted doing it. They won't have to do anything else, but they can contribute. And it's something which I've have done with a couple of charities to get somebody to do nothing but minute taking, and it benefited the whole organisation.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you, Michael. I am just going to sneak a follow-up question that's come through the chat because I think this is the moment to ask it. Charlotte's asking, have you got any advice for where to draw that line between operational and governance in small charities? Certainly something that I've felt managing as a CEO, board relationships in smaller organizations, and equally being on the board of smaller organizations, is how do I make it really clear when I'm wearing my governance hat, when I'm wearing my operations hat? So do any of you have any suggestions or advice on how to manage that? And we'll come to Pen, please, first.
Yeah, and the way that we approached it, just so that the whole board was comfortable with our actions, and indeed sort of like the members and service users, was to sort of firstly do a bit of risk management. So get an outside input into how risky are each type of action. You know, if we are hands-on with a building, or if we're hands-on with staff processes, where does that expose us to risk of things like breaching any particular regulations or laws about HR and payment, that kind of thing. So we reached out to our auditors in the first instance to sort of them to audit our risk basically and see what we were doing and see what we might need to separate out. But then we reached out to people like, in this case, it was a WVCA MENI, because we were in Wales. That was the Office Ag Association. So we had a foot in each country, to be fair. We were on the border, but it was the Welsh one we reached out to, and they really helped us with sort of get our house in order, really, to sort of look through all of our procedures. Maybe do we need to sort of change our operational procedures a little bit? Do we need to change our policies a little bit? Just so that it was that outside authority and outside voice that was informing our actions, so that it wasn't all put on one member of the board, and it wasn't put on one trustee to make change or to stick their neck out and do something and then expose them to individual risks. So it was important for us to sort of get that advice to change things.
Thanks, Pen. Michael, would you like to come in next?
Yes, I think the only thing I would say is that one charity I was involved in, the chairman said to the chief executive, "Now, can we do a 10-minute operational discussion?" And the chief executive would go into what operational issues, what's happening on the ground, and people could ask her questions. Right, anybody else on that? No, good. Right, let's move to the trustee meeting now. So that was not part of the trustee meeting. It was a separate, almost discussion. And it worked quite well. It did keep the board from getting back to the operational discussions. So I certainly would recommend that as a methodology. It is difficult between the size of charities, and you were saying, Ben, I think if you've got a big charity and you've got auditors and you've got expertise, which you can draw on to look at that, then that's always helpful. But you don't have that in the small charities. It's really, if you've got an examiner, you won't get him to come and give you that sort of advice, probably.
Thanks, Michael. That's really helpful to actually sort of set aside separate time for discussions for operations versus governance. Menai, do you have anything to add in terms of advice for separating those two elements out?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously Michael's point about the chief exec and chair, so the chair being really clear on what the role of the board is, and that kind of leadership piece there. I think as well that there's a role description ideally for all trustees, so it's clear from the start what the expectations are, code of conduct, etc., and that kind of induction and training as well. And yeah, that the chair and chief executive, if there are paid staff, have those kind of conversations and clarity of roles, where if there is a kind of blurring of the lines, that there can be a discussion of saying, oh, maybe one of the trustees is kind of going over a bit the operational, and you can have those honest conversations as well, so you can tackle any issues before they become large issues.
Thank you.
On your comment there, going back into operational issues, from experience, I would say that the charities where the majority of the board are operational in the charity tend to go to that extreme. Where they're all external trustees, it can stay above. So I think it does depend upon what is the composition of the board, and the chairman, as you say, takes a big amount of responsibility for that behaviour.
Thanks, Michael. And Ange, did you have anything you'd like to add in
I
terms
I think I'd support all of the comments, and especially the role of the chair and the chief executive, and focus on training, etc. Getting on board, we like to say noses in, fingers out. And I know a key frustration through my own consultancy work of small charity chief execs is, I think Michael reflected it earlier, they don't, in very small charities, don't have capacity, and these extra demands from trustees for information they don't really need and isn't really appropriate is too much. So I think that self-awareness within ourselves as small charity trustees is important.
Thanks, Ange. And Sue's made a really good point in the chat in saying that it's important to keep the roles of a volunteer and a trustee separate. So if you are contributing operationally at a smaller organisation, knowing and being really clear with yourself and with others, whether that is in your role as a trustee or whether that is in your role as an operational volunteer on top of your governance role as a trustee. Thank you, Sue. That's a really helpful addition. There are other questions coming up in the chat, and I haven't forgotten about those. I will come on to those at the end of the conversation, but I just want to move us on now to one of the other discussion points that I was keen to hear your thoughts on. And Ange, I can see that you've kind of already mentioned one of these in the chat. What are some of the advantages, do you think, of being a trustee of a smaller organisation, and also the advantages of being a trustee of a larger organisation? Ange, let's start with you, because I can already see that in the chat you've put something about the joys, brackets, and stress of being a trustee of a smaller organisation. What are some of the advantages for you?
That's right. I think the personal development, learning and agility that you develop as a small charity trustee is immeasurable, really, in terms of all aspects of your professional life and your personal life. It's a little more, because it's structured, I suppose, a little bit more predictable as to what you're going to encounter. And, you know, even the professionalized minute taking that Michael mentioned, the sharing of paperwork in advance, committee meetings in between, all of that structure helps you to arrive feeling very prepared. You know, the bare minimum for any charity trustee is to read the papers well in advance, and that doesn't always happen, as we know. But I think with a large charity, you get the information that you need, and there are staff available to talk to if you do require further information. You have to be quite creative sometimes as a small charity trustee, and especially as chair, where you're handling personalities and behaviours as well that you probably wouldn't do in a larger charity that has an HR function. You know, often it's the general manager, if you're lucky to have one, that would handle those things in a small charity, and most don't have staff or many staff, as we've said.
Thanks, Ange. Ken, what are your thoughts on this one?
I think for smaller charities, there's so much more opportunity to get really hands-on with an issue that you feel very strongly about or very passionate about. So you can see relatively immediate change, or you can affect that change happening. You can get very directly involved with a cause or a community that you really want to work with, a lot easier than a large charity. But that does come then with the issues of getting perhaps slightly too involved and that blurring of the lines we were talking about previously. Whereas a larger charity, you could potentially see some larger impacts happening because they'll have a bigger reach, or they've got bigger weight funding wise behind them, bigger capacity to do bigger projects. So there's a different scale of the way you can impact either a community or a cause that you're interested in, because it's that you might be less directly involved and you won't be speaking necessarily to the community or towards the cause that you're speaking of, but you know that more widely you've seen something that you've taken part in or something that you've supported as a board happen or occur. So it's sort of less direct but potentially wider reaching as a bigger organisation.
Thanks, Pen. And Menai, what are your favourite things about being a trustee of a smaller organisation and equally being a trustee of those larger organisations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really enjoy, the experience I've had across all the organisations, and I think I'd recommend anyone experiencing being a trustee of a small charity and a large organisation as well. I think in terms of a large organisation, you get to experience maybe a bit more specialism in certain areas. So, for example, you could join an audit committee, remuneration committee, strategy committee. So kind of maybe those higher level areas possibly, and that's really interesting, and you get to learn a lot about clearly kind of the governance of large organizations and so forth. So that's really, really interesting and very engaging. And in terms of smaller organizations, you can really be, as we've just said, close to the difference, the impact, be really involved and really see the difference and be really part of that team, and you get to know the people. So it's quite a different experience. But as I said, I really enjoy both of them, and I think you can get learnings and opportunities from all size organizations as a trustee.
Thank you. And Michael, what's your experience of this?
I think it's totally different, because in the smaller charities, you get to see all the beneficiaries, or as many as you can, and you can see what's happening to them, and you can hear from them their stories and where the progress has been made. When you get to the large charity, you don't have that direct access. You have to make time to get that direct access. You have to sometimes bully them, I want to do this, to get your access. So that, I think, is a big difference. And while on that point, the difference, I think the committees of the big charities are very functional, very organized, very disciplined. And I certainly, in the 3 charities I've been involved in, have encouraged bringing 1 or 2 external people onto their subcommittees. So if you're thinking of becoming a trustee, I would always say, if that comes up, a chance to sit on the particular committee, the fundraising, the finance committee, the risk committee, gives you an experience of what the charity is doing, but doesn't tie you into the whole of the operational issues. And I think it's a good way of easing, for a first-time trustee, easing into a trustee role.
Thank you, Michael. And so let's flip this on its head now. Talked about some of the things that you really enjoy about being a trustee of smaller or larger organizations. So let's talk about some of the challenges. I think we've touched on this a bit in that first discussion point about the most noticeable differences. But if we get into the detail a bit more of some of the specific challenges that you've experienced when you've been a trustee of a smaller organization, and equally some of those very specific challenges that you've come across when you've been a trustee at a larger organization. Let's move on to that now. And Ange, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Vic. I was just finishing off very quickly a note in the comments. So just to reiterate, I got the right question. The challenges faced by both sizes was your question.
Yeah,
so
some of the specific difficulties or challenges that you've experienced at both sizes.
Okay, so I'll speak personally about, because at Getting on Board, our mission is to change the face of trusteeship, and I am an associate because I feel so passionately about this. I feel one of the challenges when it comes to recruitment and retention by the very large, or the larger to very large charities, is they might have the budget to recruit trustees. Universities, for example, the go-to can often be things like guardian education, etc., etc. What happens if trustees aren't looking? So with my appointment, it was a very specific strategic stage. The college, it was College of Art. They were awarding degrees through Open University and wanted to degree awarding powers before applying for university title. But for that, they needed somebody who brought equality and governance expertise, and that's quite niche. So they'd advertised within Guardian Ed. I wasn't even looking for a board role at that point. I was only a few years into self-employment. I've been on boards and committees. And actually, it was through my broad networks that somebody suggested me, and I went through the same interview process as everybody else. Small charities don't often have that, or perceive that they don't have the budget to recruit externally, when in fact things like beach volunteering and others, and good use of social media, can help really boost the networks, and then the kind of partners that we all work with, Young Trustees Network, ATRD, Back on Board, and Queer Trustees and so on. You know, there are lots of avenues to reach a broader talent pool of trustees, and I do see that entrenched kind of behaviour as something that's still restricting diversity on large charity boards, and equating, and this is often an elephant in the room, diversity, whatever the characteristics, equals lower quality, when that's not true. So there's that, and I think with smaller charities, often because of the situations, and you know, we're in this long tail of COVID and the cost of living crisis, demand has in some cases quadrupled. They haven't got the headspace to think strategically, including things like succession planning and recruitment. So I've been seeing this bigger picture for many, many years, and getting on board in other organisations. I know yours are working to address that, but it's challenging.
Thanks, Ange. Menai, if we come to you next.
Yeah, thank you. I think in terms of small organisations, I think my main reflection there is touching on what Ange said around the kind of, clearly it's during COVID, etc., the demand has increased in the organisation, and equally as a trustee, I think the demands on your time, and sometimes you need to roll up your sleeves and support on the operational side of things. You know, obviously we've already talked about the boundaries, but sometimes there is nobody else. You know, because it is a small organisation, maybe relying on volunteers, etc., limited budgets. You know, so sometimes there is a demand on your time and to support hands-on, really. So I think that can be a challenge, and you have to make time to really support your team. I think as well, I suppose my concern as well as a trustee for the well-being of the team, etc., seeing the pressures that they're working under as volunteers, etc., knowing that we've got limited resources to help them. So I would see that as a challenge as well. I think really then in terms of large organisations, I think they can be very complex. So the governance structures can be very, very complex. So actually taking that time to understand the regulatory landscape, and with that then the paperwork that you often get. Sometimes you can have board papers that are a few hundred pages in long, and then obviously you've got audit committee papers, and so I think you can have volumes of information to try and work through and really understand. So you can start to really kind of bottom out, understand the organisation that you're working to. So I suppose those would be maybe my thoughts on that question. Thank you.
I am horrified to hear that there are some board papers that are hundreds of pages long. You were all sort of nodding like, oh yeah, that's just what happens. Like, excuse me? My goodness. Michael, you look as if you're itching to come in on this one.
No, if I get a board paper of 100 and 200 pages, I always turn to the last 3 pages of it, because there is where the tricky bit is, which they don't want you to read. And often I've been asked the question of the person who wrote the paper, what did you mean by that sentence on page 94? And they're padding it out to try and get their message through, which they fail to do. But on challenges, I think most of the things have been raised. But I think when you've got a small charity, certainly 2 or 3 of them, the person that was key to it, the chief executive, was making it work. And somebody would say, don't ask her anything more, she's a bit fragile, or don't tell him that because he won't like it. And there was a sort of softly keep him on board, keep her on board, because we need him or her. And I thought, no, that's not the way we should be doing it. And you actually end up by becoming not an effective trustee, because the trustee role must be able to be challenging, politely and correctly, but challenging people and what they're actually doing. And if you were saying what's the biggest challenge for smaller charities, I think I would type out the charity's mission and have that on the wall, the board meeting, every time, because we start off, let's say we're going to feed the people locally, and that person hasn't got any food. We're going to find them a house. So I'm looking for a house for them. Wait a minute. Sorry, what's our mission? Yes, but you can't stop here. and the mission has to be, comes back, it may not be allowed to be doing what you're doing, but mission has to be at the core of a small charity and hold that up front and not allow mission creep. Mission creep is the worst thing for charities, and most of the charities that have floundered have gone because they've got into mission creep.
That's a really interesting point, and something I find myself saying to small charity leaders a lot is there is a bottomless pit of need and you can't respond to all of it. So let's work out what you are actually going to respond
Absolutely.
to.
Yeah.
And Pen, I could see that you were nodding enthusiastically there. So could you comment then or add to what's already been mentioned about some of those challenges that you've observed?
I think that mission creep and certainly the wider discussion of strategy is a downfall of both scales of charity. So for smaller scales, they might have a more tightly defined mission, which, like you say, can be easy to creep from, but you can really pull back on that and sort of go, no, we've got a very defined mission, let's stick to it. And like you say, Michael, having it literally pinned up somewhere or a reminder in each meeting that it exists can be really, really helpful in sort of like really targeting what you're doing and like stopping these unproductive discussions from happening. But in larger charities, the challenge is often that you might have a mission and that you might have a good strategy that is backing up that mission, but if you don't have that strategy in place, then you can waste a lot of time in discussions or in planning things that in the end don't align very well with your charitable objective and therefore might be breaching your charitable objective, and you'll get the Charity Commission having some unpleasant words with you when you do try and do some of this work. So the more complex your charity and organisation, the more complex the strategy towards what they're working to, you can have some real struggles then with prioritising your resources and prioritising the direction that you're going in. So for a larger charity, I think that's a real difficulty, is making sure that you're sticking with that charitable objective and the work towards it doesn't get siphoned off into little pockets of work that you really want to do and you could align with what you were doing, but is not directly there. And I'd like to pick up on Menai's point as well about mental well-being, and I think that really is a challenge in a lot of smaller charities. You do take on a lot, and maybe your service users or people involved with your charity can come to you personally a lot of the time. They know who you are. They might, if you're working in a local charity, they might even know where you live or where you are, so they will reach out to you personally, and that can be quite affecting, and small organizations don't have those resources to put behind supporting you with that, or signposting you to someone who can help you deal with what you might have heard or what you've had to deal with there. So I think that is mental well-being is a really big challenge for small charity trustees.
I think that's such an important point, and we talk about that often with small charity leaders, as in the CEOs or the founders or the operational team experiencing that kind of vicarious trauma or that compassion fatigue. But actually, I'm sure that that is the experience as well for many trustees of smaller organizations. Would any of you like to add anything to this before we move on to some questions from the chat?
To move on, one of your questions came through on, I saw was a comment about how do trustee boards manage volunteers, which I think is a very interesting one. I was last 7 years, my last trusteeship, with the Samaritans, with about 20,000 volunteers in 200 branches around the country. The time I joined them, they were all unincorporated charities. By the time I left, they were all incorporated or branched of the central charity. And that's worked very well. But to persuade them to move from one to the other was one of the biggest jobs the trustees had ever faced. And the trustees went round in pairs to every region, every area, and had half-day conferences with them. They were seen there, they were answering questions. And as a result, trustees got much closer to the branches respected the trustees and realized what they were doing and understood their role. And it was very rewarding, exhausting, but very rewarding. And we were able to give the branches a lot more help because they're becoming a company. They had to do a big questionnaire, like a due diligence questionnaire. And the Audit and Risk Committee, that's why I say getting good people on, the Audit and Risk Committee went through each of those and raised lots of issues. And the branches were very grateful for what we had achieved and what we'd helped them achieve. And I think the organization was much stronger when it came out of that. But it was a question of actually getting close to those volunteers. And if the volunteers see you in an ivory tower up somewhere, it doesn't work.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Ange?
Just Wanted to pick up on Pen and Manai's point about trustee well-being, because anyone who follows me knows I write about that quite a lot, and it's about setting and maintaining healthy boundaries at an individual level as well. So not feeling compelled to be pulled into joining a committee if you don't have the bandwidth to do it. You know, taking a step back and not knee-jerk responding to an email at 9 o'clock at night if you haven't got the time or the energy, or you need to reflect on it. And I think the challenge is a lot of people, whether it's large or small charities, who step up as trustees, do it because we believe in something, we're passionate about it, we want to do good in society, and sometimes at the expense of their own well-being. And so setting those boundaries, I think, is one real way to look at how you avoid burning out yourself, because you've got to manage your home life, your professional life, maybe other trustee roles, because 1 in 4 trustees hold multiple roles. So, you know, all of these things have to be managed, and we haven't got an infinite amount of energy.
Thanks, Ange. I'm going to come to some of the questions from the chat now. So I'm going to start with a question from Sarah, who asked, for aspiring trustees, would you say that starting at a larger charity is better since the operational structure is set up, or a smaller one, which is more hands-on and you can learn as you work? Pen, let's come to you first.
I'd say it's less about the scale of the charity and more about what you see in their their role posting for the trustee and what they offer in terms of support and training, because a lot of small charities now are recognizing that if they want a good range of people, lots of different experiences on their trustee board, they need to have support in place. They need to be offering things in return, like skills boosting, CV and career boosting. So I'd say that could happen at any scale of charity now. It's more important about looking for things that you know you will need. So mentoring or shadowing or support with being on a board, or you know that they are actively working on their representation, they're actively working to challenge maybe outdated systems in place, or they're really tackling barriers to participation. And I think looking for evidence is more important than looking at the scale of the charity.
Thank you. And Menai?
Yeah, I think I'd echo what Pen said. I think, you know, it's looking at what motivates you as an individual. You know, what are you passionate about? You have to be absolutely passionate about the charity that you are a trustee of, I believe, because you are one of the advocates. So I think you have to have that intrinsic motivation. And yeah, absolutely, it is about, you know, what would you like to contribute, but also, you know, how would you like to develop? What would you like to learn from the organisation? So I think you need to be clear on those things, and then look at the different kinds of organisations that are, you know, looking for trustees, and then, you know, learning more about them, looking at their culture, how inclusive they are, etc. So I think I'd look at all of those aspects, and then, you know, you then decide which size organisation, you know, might fit you where you are at the moment in your career. But nothing says later on the lines you might want to become a trustee of a larger or a smaller charity. Yeah. So.
Thanks, Menai. Michael, what's your take on this one? What would your advice be to Sarah?
I wouldn't go straight into a big charity. If you're going to a big charity nowadays, there will be a formal interview process, very formal interview process, and you'll go through a very tough set of interviews. If you don't know anything about the charity sector or the operations of charities or the problems of charities, you'll be found out in those interviews. So I would certainly recommend starting at the smaller end, or, as I said before, starting in the committees of the big charities, because you can then learn so much about how a charity operates, the differentiation between a trustee and staff members, and the difference between regulation and governance. And those things, if you go straight in and haven't had previous experience and don't know about the charity sector, you will find it quite difficult. And that's something which I think several trustees I've mentioned or seen over the years have thought they were important and very, very definitely I should be on the board, and came in and sort of stumbled over the doormat and didn't survive. They didn't realize that actually there's an enormous amount of knowledge needed about the charity sector and its operations and regulations, And if you don't have that knowledge, basic knowledge, you will make yourself look very silly in a board meeting.
Thank you, Michael. And Ange, what would your advice be here?
Okay, well, all of that. I did start obviously with a large charity, so a university, and then became to have a smaller one. So I did do it that way around. But I think, as Penn said, it's more about what support and structures the charity has. So when we talk to aspiring trustees at getting on board, we encourage you to think about the size, scale, logistics. So when and where are the meetings held? This kind of support that's been mentioned already, training, observation, induction, all of those things to make you feel confident and well equipped to join a board. And if you can get that for yourself, I don't really think there's a right way around. It's just what's the right fit for you in your current context of life, because life changes.
Thanks, Ange. I've got a question now from Jane. How much is it reasonable for trustees to delegate to a senior management team in a large charity with multiple types of activity? So the trustee role can seem impossible to do on a voluntary basis without a significant delegation in a large organisation. Michael, would you like to come in on that first?
I think you've got to remember the trustees own the charity. The money goes to the trustees in the first place, and then trustees get a delegation of all the activities to get the thing going and get all the activities done. And that deed of delegation actually has a legal standing between the trustees and the staff. So if you're a trustee, you go through that deed of delegation, yes, but you shouldn't be going outside that deed of delegation to staff members. Yes, if you're an accountant on the board and you were on the finance committee, you might well go to the chief accountant and say to him what's going on. But the worst thing you can do is to say to him, I need this information because I can make more sense. Because once you do that, then you've got a problem.
And Penn, what would your response to this one be?
Along a similar lines to Michael, in that if it doesn't exist already, you need to have a roles and responsibilities chart so that delegation lines are really clear and that everyone knows where they are and exactly what those roles and responsibilities are. And like Michael says, those lines of delegation are set so that if something does need to happen extraordinary to that, you can potentially then hold a meeting and go, look, we need to do this. Can we negotiate an evidence and leave an audit trail as to why we're doing it? And I think that's the most important thing, is that you can have all the policies in the world, but an extraordinary circumstance will happen eventually. But it's about discussing that really openly as a board and with your SMT if you have one as well, and then leaving a good clear paper trail of why you've made specific decisions.
Thank you. Menai?
Yes, I mean, I haven't got that much extra to add other than, you need to look at your articles of association, your governing documents. What are the responsibilities that only the board, could sit with the board and can only make decisions about? So you need to understand, that to start with, and then looking at things like terms of reference, delegation of authority, etc. Of course, in larger organizations, you would very much hope and expect to see those in place, but you can have simpler versions, for smaller organizations. And again, there's a helpful framework to have, and it's clear then, for example, for the chief executive and for the trustees and the committees, where decisions are made and when they have to be escalated or reported back, and so forth. So that, I think, that helps with relations and kind of board relations with staff and so forth as well. If there's clarity there around responsibility and delegation.
Ange, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I think just again, to support what Menai said, I think systems and structures, they're not, having a policy isn't going to solve all of your problems, but it's always a good starting point for discussion and help you to set those boundaries that I mentioned earlier. So just some great points by fellow panelists. Thank you.
And Michael, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think that probably fits quite well. I think the thing general public don't know, when you ask them the size of charities, you tell them things like, say, cancer research got 4,000 or 5,000 people employed. The big international one I was talking about, it just puts charities in perspective, because we had budget, the last year I was there, of over 1 billion with 11,000 people placed in 71 countries. It's a long way from rattling a tin outside the supermarket. And it's a very different culture, and it requires a very different type of trustee to do both. So if you're going to something of that size, you would have to have some experience of operating in a business and in a culture and in meetings of that sort of size. I wouldn't suggest it's the first charity you think of.
Thanks, Michael. And the last question we'll come to comes from Susan, who asks a question about recruitment and getting a trustee role at a larger charity. I've noticed that larger charities often seem to recruit for somebody with quite a specific skill, so fundraising, marketing, or finance, which can make it harder to get that kind of role if you've come from a more generalist background, i.e. operationally working in a small charity. Any thoughts on this? I know that Getting on Board is also interested in social diversity. So does the tendency to advertise for a very specific skill set also rule out people whose contribution could be valuable? And we've got just shy of 10 minutes, so we will get round to all four of you to comment on this, I think, but if you could just be mindful of the time as we get towards the end of the session. Menai, can we start with you, please? It's quite a long question. If you'd like me to repeat any of it, let me know.
Yeah, I mean, I'd hope that particularly for, well, all organisations, particularly for kind of larger organisations, that any recruitment exercise is informed by an audit of the board, of the skills and the backgrounds, and also an understanding, and that's informed by your strategy as well, looking to the future, what skills, etc., backgrounds do you need, and an understanding of, you know, underrepresentation that you have at the moment. So I'd hope that that framework would be there to inform any recruitment exercise, you know, that an organisation would undertake, and you know, therefore I would hope that you know, that they obviously would have, I would think, a diversity and inclusion equality policy and strategy, etc. So I would hope those things would already be in place. I think it's also looking, you know, you as an individual, what are the skills or whether your background, your lived experience, what do you bring as a trustee, and you know, maybe not being, if they're looking for something specific, maybe you can explain about other aspects of what you can bring, you know, and kind of broaden out your kind of application, as it were, look at all the different aspects that you can bring to an organisation. So I suppose those would be my first kind of thoughts to answer that question.
Thank you. And Pen, your thoughts on this one?
I'd agree that a successful board needs to do a diversity audit alongside its skills audit to make sure that, you know, if they're filling skills gaps, they're not just filling them with people from exactly the same lived experience or same identity or background, because that doesn't bring enough of a richness or a diversity of voice into there. And although the larger charities often will specifically look for someone, like they'll say fundraising experience, which is often all like comms experience, it's always worth applying anyway, because often those recruiters will do a sift. They'll pick 10 candidates and they'll always pick one or two that they like to call wildcards. And you know, and if you shine in that, because like you said, there probably will be an interview process, then they will like recognize the value of having someone who doesn't quite meet that skills that they're needing, but they think, oh, but they do fill this other requirement that we were probably looking for, that we should have maybe recruited for. So it's always worth that reaching out, I think, and it's always worth responding to an advert and just saying to people, oh, I noticed you're looking for X, Y, and Z skill, but you know, what's your representation of these things like, or have you considered needing this skill or background? So it's always worth a bit of a chance, I feel.
I love that advice about reaching out and asking some questions, or just picking up the phone and trying to have a conversation if it's a cause that you're really interested in. I like that advice a lot. Thanks, Pen. Ange, your thoughts on this?
Thank you. I've in part answered this in the chat, but I've suggested one of our excellent workshops run by Leon Ward. But I think some other strategies that you can think about as well are, if you want a foot in the door with a larger charity, let's say Mind, they have local and regional branches, they have committees. They're often a really good way to get a foot in the door, get a feel for that organisation, and then be able to apply for the main board of some of those bigger national charities, without you necessarily having to have skills like risk, audit, etc., that they typically look for. And there's a good reason for it, because of the extent of the resources that they're governing, you know, but I think just using strategies like that on a practical level can be a really great way to get involved in some of the very big charities.
Thanks. And Michael, your thoughts on this?
Very difficult one, this, because it's not the chairman that's doing the recruiting. He's delegated it to the HR people, and they have their framework and template, and they tick boxes. And you're rightly saying, Ben, it's very difficult to get onto the list, the shorter list, if they're doing that box ticking. And I don't think there's an answer to that, because if they've done the skills audit and the diversity audit, they've decided what sort of person with what sort of skills they need to fit their board in the future. And very difficult to break that down. I think going back to the point I made earlier and the point you made, Anne, I think getting on a subcommittee or a branch of a bigger organization, understanding that organization from inside is a much better way. And then you can talk with sense when you get to an interview, if you get that interview. And I think it's about getting in front of them. If you've got a passion for it, if you've got a desire for it, and if you've got a skill for what you do, then there always will be interested. And again, last on that, just because they say they don't need you now, it's still worth putting your application in and saying, if an application comes up for a fundraiser, I know I'm not a fundraiser, but I would love to be involved there. And you'll find they'll jot it down. And just when you don't expect it, they'll suddenly come back and say, are you still interested? So I would put it in, say what you can do, say what you'd like to do, and say how free and available you could be.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. And I just want to add something from the chat that's come from Sapna, who says, I use this phrase on adverts to encourage those wild cards. Please note that if these criteria, let's start again. Please note that these criteria are indicative. If they do not fit your career journey, but you still know you have a lot to offer our membership, we'd love to hear from you. I think that's a really lovely example of that kind of open-minded recruitment that will allow for people to take a bit of a punt on a role. I'm just going to check the chat to see whether there are any final questions. I can't see any final questions. So Penny, I think I'll be coming to you to just hand over and close us in a minute. But I just want to say a huge thank you to Michael, Ange, Menai and Pen. It's been so interesting to hear this. And I'm sure it's been really interesting for our attendees as well. And thanks to Penny and all of the team at Getting On Board for inviting me to be part of this discussion. Over to you, Penny.
Thank you so much, Vic and panel. Absolutely brilliant discussion, really, really interesting. I've posted in the chat a link to the evaluation form. Please do tell us what you thought of this session. You'll also get that form in follow-up emails. You'll get it when you close this Zoom as well. A reminder that tonight, Sapna, who's been commenting in the chat at this session, Sapna's running a networking session for us at 7:30. We've posted the link to the session at least twice in the chat. Please copy it over or look in your follow-up email, which will come to you this afternoon. Or if you're a weekly pass holder, it was on your daily links email from Eventbrite this morning. They are an opportunity to meet with other aspiring and serving trustees to discuss face-to-face, actually use our voices rather than our fingers typing to talk about some of these issues. So we'd love to see you there. In terms of other events, we've still got 2.5 days left of the festival. I'm just going to signpost a couple of events to you. 5 o'clock this afternoon. This is the one I am most looking forward to in the whole festival. Sorry, Vic. Which is Speakers Corner for Trustees. We've got 7 speakers talking about what they want to bin or revolutionise about trusteeship. Our chair this is my spare. So she's got her klaxon. She's just told me that she's been travelling up and down the country with it and it keeps going off. So, she's really put herself through it for this. You get to vote, basically, on what people are proposing. That's at 5 o'clock tonight. Tomorrow we've got fundraising faux pas, what trustees have done to muck up getting money. That's at 11:30 in the morning. And on Thursday we've got frontline volunteers to trustees, which Fiona, our colleague at Getting On Board, is chairing, which has been mentioned in the chat as well. And also please do check out Getting On Board and our other organisations that are represented here. We're here all year round. So we're doing this big splash in Trustees Week, but actually we're here all year round. So do check out what support we can offer you as trustees. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you in particular to Vic and Michael and Ange and Menai and Pen, and hope to see you later in the festival. Bye, everybody.